What do you do with the cars of a dictator? When American soldiers stormed into the mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden in the spring of 1945, they found something extraordinary waiting for them in the garages. Gleaming beneath layers of dust, enormous, armoured and unmistakably powerful, sat a fleet of vehicles unlike anything most of those young soldiers had ever seen. These were not ordinary automobiles. They were rolling fortresses of steel and glass, custom-built to the specifications of one of the most feared and reviled men in human history. They were the personal Mercedes-Benz vehicles of Adolf Hitler, and the question of what would happen to them would prove to be one of the most fascinating, controversial, and at times deeply uncomfortable stories to emerge from the wreckage of the Second World War. For over a decade, these machines had been central to the public image of the Third Reich. They had carried Hitler through the streets of Vienna after the Anschluss, through Paris after France's humiliating capitulation, and through city after city across occupied Europe as Germany's armies swept across the continent. Millions of people had lined those streets, whether in forced celebration or in silent terror, and watched as these enormous black automobiles rolled past, Hitler standing upright in the passenger compartment with one arm raised in his signature salute. The cars were more than transportation. They were propaganda instruments, symbols of German technological supremacy, and physical extensions of Hitler's own carefully constructed mythology of power. So when Germany fell, when the war ended and the Führer lay dead in his bunker, these extraordinary machines scattered across the chaos of defeat, each beginning its own strange and improbable journey through the decades that followed. In this video, we will find out exactly what happened to Hitler's personal Mercedes-Benz vehicles after World War II, tracing each surviving car from the ruins of the Third Reich through the hands of American generals, war bond salesmen, private collectors, and museum curators, all the way to the present day. Some of these cars sold at auction for millions of dollars. Others sit quietly in museum collections, drawing enormous crowds of visitors who gaze upon them with a mixture of fascination and horror. And some remain objects of fierce debate, their very existence raising uncomfortable questions about history, memory, ownership, and the dark allure of the most evil regime in modern history. So without further ado, let us start at the very beginning with the story of how Adolf Hitler fell in love with a Mercedes-Benz. It is impossible to understand the post-war fate of Hitler's cars without first understanding the extraordinary relationship between the man and the automobile. Hitler was not merely a politician who used cars for transport. He was a genuine automotive obsessive, a man who had harbored a passionate fascination with motor vehicles since his earliest years, long before he had any realistic prospect of owning one. Growing up in poverty and obscurity in Vienna and Munich, Hitler spent considerable time sketching automobiles in his notebooks, dreaming of speed and mechanical power. He had never learned to drive himself. He never held a driver's license in his entire life. But this did not diminish his obsession. If anything, it deepened it, transforming the automobile into a kind of fantasy object, something that represented not merely transportation, but status, modernity, and German industrial genius. The car that would define this obsession was the Mercedes-Benz. Hitler's relationship with the Stuttgart manufacturer dated back to at least 1923, when he first encountered their vehicles in Munich during the turbulent early years of the Nazi Party. The party used a red Mercedes touring car, one of several vehicles acquired for Nazi activities during this period, and Hitler immediately recognized in the Mercedes something that matched his own grandiose vision of German power and sophistication. The brand represented everything he wanted the Third Reich to embody: technical brilliance, commanding presence, and an unapologetic assertion of superiority. From that moment, Hitler's personal identification with the three-pointed star would only intensify, eventually becoming one of the most carefully cultivated aspects of his public image. By the time the Nazis came to power in January 1933, Hitler had already established a deep personal relationship with the Mercedes-Benz company and its vehicles. He had been transported in Mercedes cars throughout the campaigns of the late 1920s and early 1930s, and the imagery of Hitler riding through jubilant crowds in an open-topped Mercedes had become central to Nazi political imagery. Jakob Werlin, a Mercedes-Benz dealer from Munich who had been personally acquainted with Hitler since the early 1920s, served as the crucial bridge between the Führer and the East. Stuttgart manufacturer, Werlin had sold Hitler several vehicles over the years, extended generous credit terms to the cash-strapped Nazi movement, and cultivated a friendship with Hitler that would eventually see him appointed as a senior figure within the German automotive industry. Through Werlin, the relationship between Hitler and Mercedes-Benz became something deeper than a simple commercial arrangement. It became a partnership, one that would shape the visual iconography of the Third Reich for 12 years. The vehicle that would become most closely associated with Hitler, the machine that appears in thousands of photographs and newsreels from the Nazi era, was the Mercedes-Benz 770, officially designated the Type 770 or Grosser Mercedes. The designation Grosser, meaning great or grand in German, was entirely appropriate. These were immense automobiles by any standard. The 770 had first been introduced in 1930 as the W W7 series, designed specifically to meet the demand for a flagship state car that could carry heads of state and dignitaries in a manner befitting their status. The car was built on a wheelbase of nearly 3.8 metres, and its overall length approached 6 metres. It weighed well over 3,000 kilograms, even in its unarmoured configuration, making it one of the heaviest production vehicles in the world at the time. Powering this enormous machine was an equally remarkable engine, a 7.7-litre inline 8-cylinder unit that in naturally aspirated form produced approximately 150 horsepower. But the 770 was also available with an optional supercharger, a Roots-type blower that, when engaged by pressing the accelerator pedal firmly to the floor, boosted output to approximately 230 horsepower. The supercharger did not operate continuously. It was engaged only on demand, producing a dramatic howling sound that contemporaries found both thrilling and slightly intimidating, as if the car itself was roaring in response to the driver's command. This mechanical theatre perfectly suited Hitler's theatrical instincts. The sound of a supercharged Grosser Mercedes at full throttle was unmistakable, and it became part of the sonic landscape of Nazi ceremony and spectacle. In 1938, Mercedes-Benz introduced the second generation of the 770, the W150 series, which would become even more closely associated with Hitler and the height of Nazi power. The W150 was a thoroughly updated design compared to its predecessor, featuring a more powerful version of the supercharged straight-8 engine, now producing up to 230 horsepower in normal operation, and considerably more with the blower engaged. The chassis was redesigned with an oval tubular space frame that provided greater rigidity, and the suspension was upgraded to handle the enormous weight of the armoured bodywork that would be fitted to most of the cars ordered by Hitler's government. The W150 was, in almost every respect, the most sophisticated and capable automobile available anywhere. In the world in the late 1930s, and Hitler ordered it in considerable numbers. The armoured versions of the W150, known internally as the Sonderschutzwagen, or Special Protection Vehicles, represented an entirely different level of engineering complexity. The standard W150 was already a remarkably heavy automobile. The armoured versions were in a category of their own. Steel armour plate was fitted to the body panels, floor and firewall, with specially developed laminated bulletproof glass up to 40 mm thick installed in the windows. The doors were reinforced with armour to the point where each one weighed several hundred kilograms and required considerable effort to open and close. The total weight of a fully armoured W150 could reach 4.5 tons, and some particularly heavily protected examples were even heavier than that. To cope with this extraordinary mass, the tyres were specially designed run-flat units that could continue to operate even after being punctured, allowing the car to continue moving even under fire. Despite this extraordinary weight, the armoured Grosser Mercedes remained capable of reaching speeds approaching 160 km per hour on a good road, a testament to the enormous power of its supercharged engine and the skill of the Mercedes-Benz engineers who had developed it. The car's handling was another matter entirely. At the limit of its capabilities, the massive W150 was a challenging vehicle to control, its weight and length making it demanding for even experienced drivers. This was one reason why the pool of men trusted to drive Hitler's personal vehicles was kept deliberately small and subject to extremely rigorous selection. Only the most skilled and trustworthy chauffeurs were permitted behind the wheel of the Führer's cars, and even they operated under extraordinarily strict protocols designed to protect their passenger at all costs. The man who served as Hitler's primary personal chauffeur for most of the war years and the individual who knew the Führer's Mercedes fleet better than perhaps anyone else alive was Erich Kempka. Born in Oberhausen in 1910, Kempka had joined the SS and entered Hitler's personal service in 1932, initially as one of several drivers in the Führerbegleitkommando, the Führer's escort command. He proved himself capable, discreet, and utterly loyal, qualities that Hitler valued above almost everything else in those who served in his immediate circle. By 1936, Kempka had become Hitler's head chauffeur, the man responsible for managing the fleet of vehicles that transported the Führer and overseeing the team of drivers who operated them. He would hold this position until the final days of the war, right up to the point when he assisted in the disposal of Hitler's body in the Reich Chancellery Garden in April 1945. Kempka's testimony after the war, combined with records from Mercedes-Benz and various Allied intelligence reports, provides a remarkably detailed picture of the fleet of vehicles that Hitler used throughout his time in power. The numbers are surprising to anyone who imagines Hitler travelling in a single vehicle. In reality, the Führer's motor pool was extensive. At any given time during the peak years of Nazi power, between roughly 1938 and 1943, Hitler had access to somewhere between 15 and 25 individual vehicles, spread across his various residences and maintained by a team of mechanics who were themselves sworn to secrecy about the details of the fleet. These included the armoured W150 open tourers used for public appearances and parades, closed saloon versions for private travel, lighter and faster escort vehicles used by the SS protection detail, and various utility vehicles for the enormous support apparatus that travelled with Hitler wherever he went. Not all of these vehicles were identical. Even within the category of armoured W150 tourers, there were meaningful differences between individual cars, reflecting the continuous development and refinement of the design over the years. Some cars had been fitted with additional armour at a later date, increasing their weight and reducing their performance. Others had different configurations of seating and bodywork, reflecting the specific requirements of the occasion for which they had been built. Hitler himself had strong opinions about certain aspects of his vehicles, including the colour. While early Nazi-era images sometimes show Hitler in dark vehicles of varying shades, by the late 1930s, his personal cars had been standardized in a specific dark grey colour, sometimes described as Führergrau, a tone that photographed dramatically well in the black and white imagery of the era, and that conveyed a sense of martial solemnity appropriate to the occasion. The public spectacle of Hitler arriving at or departing from an event in one of his Grosse Mercedes Tourers was a carefully choreographed performance, one that was repeated hundreds of times throughout the Nazi period. The protocol surrounding these appearances was elaborate and precisely defined. The car would pull up to a designated point with the SS escort vehicles already in position. Hitler would stand in the passenger compartment, holding a special grab rail that had been fitted to allow him to maintain his footing during the slow, rolling entrances that were the signature of Nazi parades. His right arm would extend in the Heil salute as the car moved through the crowds. Photographers were positioned at predetermined locations to capture specific angles, ensuring that the imagery of Hitler in his open Mercedes would have maximum dramatic impact when reproduced in newspapers, magazines, and the ubiquitous propaganda films of the era. This spectacle reached its most extraordinary expression during the great triumph parades that followed German military victories in the early years of the war, when Hitler entered Vienna in March 1938. Following the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, the scenes of the crowds pressing toward his Mercedes were captured on film and broadcast throughout the world, a carefully managed demonstration of what the Nazi propaganda apparatus presented as spontaneous popular enthusiasm. The same imagery was repeated in Prague in March 1939 following the occupation of Czechoslovakia, and most dramatically of all in Paris on June 28, 1940, when Hitler made his famous early morning tour of the conquered French capital. On that occasion, Hitler's visit was so brief that the full ceremonial parade apparatus was not employed, but the image of the Führer stepping out of his Mercedes before the Eiffel Tower and at the Paris Opera became one of the most iconic photographs of the entire war. It is worth pausing for a moment to consider just how significant these vehicles were as instruments of Nazi propaganda. The Grosse Mercedes was not chosen by accident. Hitler and his propaganda chief Joseph, Goebbels understood perfectly that the imagery of their leader in an enormous, powerful, unmistakably German automobile carried a specific message that resonated with audiences both in Germany and abroad. The car said, "Germany is powerful. Germany is modern. Germany is technologically superior." At a time when Germany was emerging from the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty and the economic catastrophe of the Weimar years, the sight of Hitler in a magnificent, roaring, supercharged German automobile was a potent symbol of national renewal, or at least of what the Nazi Party wanted Germans to believe national renewal looked like. The cars were props in the most elaborate and deadly political theatre in modern history. Mercedes-Benz, for its part, was not an unwilling participant in this arrangement. The company had been struggling through the economic difficulties of the Weimar period and had welcomed the close relationship with the Nazi regime as an enormous commercial and reputational benefit. Receiving orders for dozens of specially built state cars was profitable in itself, but the publicity value of having the world's most photographed political figure arrive everywhere in your vehicles was incalculable. Every newsreel showing Hitler in a Grosser Mercedes was, in effect, an advertisement for the brand. Daimler-Benz AG, the parent company of Mercedes-Benz, was deeply integrated into the Nazi war economy, producing aircraft engines, trucks and military vehicles in enormous quantities using forced labour from concentration camps. The company would eventually acknowledge this history, establishing a foundation for historical research and compensation in the 1990s. But at the time, the partnership between the three-pointed star and the swastika was pursued enthusiastically by both parties. The relationship extended beyond merely supplying vehicles. Jakob Werlin, Hitler's longtime Mercedes contact, was appointed by Hitler as the General Inspector of German Motor Transport in 1942, giving him an extraordinary degree of authority over the entire German automotive industry during wartime. Through Werlin, Mercedes-Benz maintained an almost uniquely privileged position within the Nazi industrial apparatus, with direct access to the highest levels of political power. When Hitler wanted a new vehicle or a modification to an existing one, the request went through Werlin to Stuttgart, where the company's engineers would work to fulfill the Führer's requirements with the highest priority. This arrangement produced some of the most extraordinary vehicles ever built, but it also entangled one of Germany's greatest industrial companies deeply in the machinery of the worst regime in history. By 1943 and 1944, as the war turned decisively against Germany and Allied bombing began to devastate German cities, production of the 770K wound down. The factory resources required to build these enormous, labour-intensive machines were needed for more pressing military purposes. The last W150s were completed in 1943, and from that point on, Hitler's fleet remained static, a collection of increasingly precious machines that were carefully maintained but could not be replaced. As the war dragged on and Germany's situation became ever more desperate, Hitler retreated progressively into a smaller and smaller world, spending most of his time in the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia or in the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. The great parade appearances that had been the primary showcase for the Grosser Mercedes fleet became increasingly rare and then ceased altogether. The cars sat in garages at Berchtesgaden, at the Reich Chancellery, and at other locations across what remained of the shrinking Third Reich, waiting for the end. The end, when it came, was swift and chaotic. In the final weeks of April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin from the east and American and British forces drove in from the west, the careful arrangements that had governed the storage and maintenance of Hitler's vehicle fleet collapsed entirely. Some of the cars at the Berlin Reich Chancellery were destroyed during the intense Soviet artillery bombardment that reduced much of the German capital to rubble. Others were hastily moved by surviving members of Hitler's staff and the SS, driven out of the city in the chaos of the final collapse and hidden in various locations in the hope of preservation. And the cars at Berchtesgaden, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria, remained largely intact as American forces swept in at the beginning of May, finding them waiting in the garages of the various residences clustered around the Obersalzberg. These vehicles, the ones that survived the fall of the Reich, would become the subjects of one of the strangest and most contentious stories in the entire history of the automobile. The soldiers who first laid eyes on Hitler's cars at Berchtesgaden were members of the American 3rd Infantry Division, which had captured the area in the first days of May 1945. What they found at the Berghof, Hitler's famous mountain home, and at the nearby SS barracks and support facilities, was a scene of extraordinary destruction mixed with extraordinary preservation. The Berghof itself had been badly damaged by British bombing raids in April, and subsequent looting and deliberate destruction by SS troops who had attempted to remove or destroy anything of value before the Americans arrived. But the garages, hidden beneath the mountainside and somewhat more protected from both bombs and looters, still contained a remarkable collection of vehicles. Several large, dark, enormously powerful automobiles sat in the underground parking areas, their condition reflecting the care that had been lavished on them over years of meticulous maintenance by Kempke's team of mechanics. To the American soldiers who discovered them, they were simultaneously trophies of war, curiosities, and symbols of the fallen regime's extraordinary excess. The specific vehicles found at Berchtesgaden in those first days of May 1945 have been the subject of considerable historical debate and occasional confusion, largely because the chaos of the final days of the war made precise record-keeping impossible, and because in the months and years that followed, various parties had strong incentives to exaggerate or misrepresent the provenance of vehicles they had acquired. What is clear from contemporary photographs, Allied military records, and the subsequent testimony of individuals involved is that at least 3 and possibly as many as 5 armoured WW150 Grosse Mercedes Tourers were located at Berchtesgaden, along with a number of other vehicles. These cars were immediately recognized as extraordinary prizes, and the competition among American commanders to claim them as personal trophies began almost immediately. General John Iron Mike O'Daniel, the commander of the 3rd Infantry Division, managed to secure at least one of the large Mercedes Tourers for his own use and was photographed being driven through Berchtesgaden in an enormous open Grosse Mercedes in the days immediately following the capture of the area. He was far from alone in recognizing the trophy value of these vehicles. The American military command in the European theatre was immediately confronted with a practical problem. These cars were enormous, extraordinarily valuable, and represented a propaganda and morale opportunity that was too significant to pass up. The decision was made at a relatively high level to ship several of the captured vehicles back to the United States, where they could be displayed to the American public as tangible evidence of Nazi excess and American victory. What happened next would set these automobiles on journeys that in some cases would last for decades. The logistics of managing such a large and highly specialized fleet were themselves remarkable, representing a level of organizational complexity that most people do not associate with what was essentially a transport operation. The Führerbegleitkommando maintained a complete workshop capable of handling the maintenance and repair of all the vehicles in the fleet, staffed by qualified mechanics who had been vetted by the SS security apparatus and sworn to secrecy. These men worked with vehicles that were technically demanding even by peacetime commercial garage standards, and the conditions under which they operated became increasingly difficult as the war progressed. Spare parts for the enormous 770K supercharged engines were not readily available off the shelf, and maintaining the complex mechanical systems, including the supercharger drives, the specialized run-flat tire systems, and the extraordinarily heavy armored doors and windows, required both expertise and dedicated supply chains that had to be maintained even as Germany's overall industrial situation deteriorated. The fuel consumption of these vehicles was another logistical challenge that grew increasingly significant as the war continued. A fully loaded armoured W150, returning 12 to 15 litres per 100 kilometres at best in normal driving, and considerably more under hard acceleration, required a substantial fuel allocation that had to be guaranteed, even when overall German fuel supplies were under increasing pressure from Allied bombing of oil installations and refineries. In the later war years, as synthetic fuel production struggled to keep pace with military demand, even the Führerbegleitkommando's vehicles were not entirely immune from supply difficulties, though they naturally received priority treatment in the allocation process. The specific numbering and registration of the vehicles in Hitler's fleet was itself a matter of elaborate protocol. German state vehicles operated under a special registration system that identified them as government property, and the cars in the Führer's personal escort had their own designation within this system. The registration plates of the period and the specific numbers allocated to individual vehicles in Hitler's fleet are among the details that researchers have worked to reconstruct from photographs and documents, since these numbers can in principle be used to cross-reference specific vehicles with the records that survive in various archives. The exercise is difficult because the numbers are often partially obscured in period photographs and because there is evidence that some vehicles had their registrations changed over time as they moved between different official functions. The question of how many people actually rode in these cars during the Nazi era is more complex than it might appear. While the primary association is obviously with Hitler himself, the vehicles served a broader function as state cars for the Nazi government, and a significant number of senior Nazi and military figures travelled in them, for official purposes. When Hitler received foreign dignitaries, those dignitaries were often transported in the Grosse Mercedes as part of the ceremonial reception. When senior German commanders visited the Führerhauptquartier for military conferences, they might be collected from the nearest railway station in one of the fleet vehicles. And when Hitler travelled between his residences, the convoy of vehicles typically included not just his own car, but cars carrying secretaries, aides, military adjutants, and the various members of his immediate entourage whose presence he considered essential. These people are now largely forgotten, but they too were passengers in Hitler's Mercedes, witnesses to the interior of the bubble in which he lived. The interior of the armoured W150 was itself a remarkable space, one that has been described by various people who rode in it or examined surviving examples. The passenger compartment was finished in the highest quality materials available too. The Daimler-Benz coach builders, with leather upholstery of exceptional quality, fine woodwork on the door panels and dashboard, and the kind of attention to detail that was characteristic of the most exclusive coach-building work of the period. At the same time, the interior was in some respects constrained by the demands of the armouring, with the thick bulletproof glass windows and the heavy armoured doors reducing the sense of spaciousness that the car's enormous external dimensions might have suggested. The grab rail that Hitler used during parades was a functional item rather than a decorative one, though it was naturally finished in materials appropriate to the overall luxury of the interior. In closed saloon versions of the W150, the partition between the passenger and driver compartments reflected the hierarchy of the Nazi state's relationship with personal service, a physical boundary between the ruler and those who served him. The story of how specific features were added to the cars based on Hitler's personal requests and security requirements provides another window into the peculiarities of the Nazi regime's relationship with its own vulnerabilities and obsessions. Hitler was deeply paranoid about assassination, a paranoia that was not entirely irrational given the number of actual attempts on his life, including the most famous near-miss of July 20th, 1944, when Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg's briefcase bomb exploded in the Wolfschanze conference room. The security arrangements around his vehicles were a direct expression of this paranoia, and they evolved throughout his time in power as the threat assessment changed. The early, relatively lightly armoured vehicles of the mid-1930s gave way progressively to the massively protected machines of the late war period, each upgrade reflecting a new level of anxiety about what external threats might look like. The July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt, though it took place at the Wolf's Lair and not in any vehicle, had direct consequences for the management of Hitler's car fleet. In the aftermath of the bomb plot, security around Hitler was dramatically tightened across all aspects of his life, including his travel arrangements. The surviving armoured W150s were subjected to additional security reviews, and new protocols were implemented for the management of the fleet, including more rigorous vetting of all personnel who had any contact with the vehicles and more elaborate procedures for checking vehicles before Hitler entered them. By this stage in the war, of course, Hitler was travelling almost exclusively between his various command headquarters and not making public appearances of the kind that would have brought him into proximity with large crowds. The parade cars sat largely idle in their garages as their owner retreated ever deeper into his underground world. The last time any of the Grosse Mercedes Tourers were used in anything approaching their intended ceremonial function was in the summer of 1944, when Hitler's public appearances had already become extremely rare. The footage from these last ceremonial uses, when it can be identified with certainty, shows a dramatically changed figure from the triumphant leader of the early parade years. Hitler, whose health had been deteriorating seriously since at least 1942, under the combined impact of the stresses of directing a losing war, the effects of the various drugs and treatments administered by his personal physician Theodor Morell, and the progressive symptoms of what was probably Parkinson's disease, appears in this later footage as a diminished and trembling figure, very different from the image of commanding authority that the early parade films had worked so hard to project. The magnificent cars remained magnificent. Their passenger did not. The final months before Germany's surrender saw the Hitler fleet dispersed in ways that reflected the general disintegration of the Nazi state. Some vehicles were driven south to Bavaria as the situation in Berlin became increasingly untenable, contributing to the concentration of cars that the Americans eventually found at Berchtesgaden. Others remained in Berlin, where they were either destroyed in the bombing or fell into Soviet hands as the Red Army completed its encirclement and capture of the German capital. The Soviet capture of several former Nazi state vehicles is itself an interesting side story. The Red Army soldiers who swept through Berlin in late April and early May 1945 helped themselves to a great deal of captured German property and vehicles of all kinds, from mundane staff cars to more significant pieces like the state limousines of various Nazi officials were driven eastward by triumphant Soviet forces. Some of these vehicles ended up in military collections or government facilities in the Soviet Union, where they remained for decades, largely inaccessible to Western researchers. The extent of the Soviet capture of Nazi vehicle assets has only become clearer since the opening of Soviet archives following the end of the Cold War. Russian historians and researchers who have examined these records have found evidence that multiple large Mercedes vehicles, potentially including some from the former Nazi state fleet, were transported to the Soviet Union in the aftermath of the war. The ultimate fate of most of these vehicles remains unclear, as the records from Soviet trophy collection operations are incomplete, and not all the captured material has been accounted for. It is at least possible that vehicles which are believed to have been destroyed or lost actually survived the war in Soviet custody, and that some may still exist in storage facilities in Russia or other former Soviet republics, though this remains speculative in the absence of definitive documentation. The broader context of Soviet trophy collection operations is relevant here because it illustrates how thoroughly the material legacy of the Nazi regime was scattered by the competing interests of the various victorious powers. The Soviets, the Americans, the British, and the French each had their own approaches to seize German property, their own priorities and institutional frameworks, and their own complex mixtures of official policy and individual opportunism. The result was a dispersal of material on a vast scale, with individual items ending up in the most unexpected locations as a function of the specific accidents of who captured what and what they decided to do with it. The Hitler Mercedes fleet was caught up in this broader dispersal, and its post-war geography reflects the chaotic partition of the Nazi state's material legacy among the victorious powers. The first major test of what would become of these vehicles came in the form of a remarkable decision by the American military to use at least one of the captured Grosse Mercedes Tourers for a war bond drive across the United States. This was not an entirely novel concept. Throughout the war, captured enemy hardware from Japanese aircraft to German tanks had been displayed across America as both propaganda and fundraising tools, drawing enormous crowds of curious civilians eager to see the physical evidence of the enemy they had been fighting. But Hitler's personal car was something altogether different. It was not merely military hardware, it was an object intimately associated with the person of Adolf Hitler himself, with all the horror and fascination that name conjured. The prospect of Americans being able to walk up to, touch, and in some cases sit in the vehicle that had carried the most reviled man in the world was an irresistible attraction. The most extensively documented of the war bond tour cars was a 1939 Mercedes-Benz 77OK Open Tourer, a W150 series vehicle that had been part of Hitler's fleet and was shipped to the United States in the summer of 1945. This car travelled across dozens of American cities in late 1945 and into 1946, displayed at war bond events, public exhibitions, and fundraising galas. The response from the American public was extraordinary. Crowds of hundreds and sometimes thousands gathered wherever the car was displayed, paying their admission fees and waiting in line for a chance to see the Führer's vehicle up close. Some visitors reportedly spat on the car, others wept. Many simply stared, struck by the incongruity of this enormous, beautiful, powerful machine sitting on a flatbed trailer in a shopping district or fairground in Iowa or Ohio, thousands of miles from the mountain roads of Bavaria, where it had once carried the ruler of a continental empire. The car was a conversation starter, a moral prompt, and a fundraising goldmine all at once. But who exactly owned these cars? And what were their specific histories? These are questions that have generated enormous controversy among automotive historians, collectors, and researchers for decades, and the answers are considerably more complicated than most people realize. The core problem is this. During the chaotic final days of the war and the immediate aftermath, multiple large armoured Mercedes Tourers were captured, moved, documented with varying degrees of care, and then dispersed in various directions. In the confusion, the paper trail became tangled. Multiple cars were described as Hitler's personal vehicle by the people who found them or sold them, and not all of these claims could possibly be true. In subsequent decades, as the values of these vehicles rose to extraordinary levels, the incentive to assert an unimpeachable connection to Hitler himself became commercially enormous, introducing a further layer of complexity and potential dishonesty into the historical record. The Mercedes-Benz archives in Stuttgart contain production records for the W150 series that provide at least a partial framework for sorting out these questions. The factory records show that a total of approximately 88 WW150 Grosser Mercedes vehicles were produced between 1938 and 1943, the entire production run of the second-generation model. Of these, a significant proportion were ordered by various state authorities and foreign governments as diplomatic gifts or state vehicles, including several that went to Japan, Finland, and other Axis and neutral countries. The vehicles specifically ordered by the German government and intended for Hitler's personal use represent a smaller subset of this already limited production run, numbering perhaps 15 to 20 vehicles in total, though the precise figure is difficult to establish definitively from available records. Of this number, some were destroyed during the war, some were scattered and lost, and only a handful survive intact today. One of the most important and well-documented surviving cars is the vehicle now held by the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, Ontario. This car, a 1939 Mercedes-Benz 770K Open Tourer, was captured during the war and eventually made its way to Canada, where it has been on public display for decades. The Canadian Museum's car is particularly significant because it is one of the most thoroughly documented of all the surviving Hitler-era Grosser Mercedes vehicles, with a relatively clear chain of custody that supports its identification as an authentic vehicle from Hitler's fleet. The car is displayed in the museum's permanent collection alongside other significant artifacts from the Second World War, where it serves as a sobering and thought-provoking object, a reminder of the aesthetic and material dimensions of totalitarianism and the extraordinary scale of the enterprise that Nazi Germany represented at its height. Each year, tens of thousands of visitors file past the car, which sits in a specially designed display space that both highlights its extraordinary craftsmanship and contextualizes it within the broader story of the war and the Nazi regime. The Canadian Museum car has its own specific history that is worth examining in some detail, because it illustrates many of the complexities that surround all of these vehicles. The car was acquired by the Canadian government in the aftermath of the war through channels that involved both direct military capture and subsequent transfers between various Allied authorities. Its armour is genuine, its interior fittings are original, and its mechanical components, though no longer operational after decades on static display, are authentic to the period. The museum has been careful to present the car in a way that neither celebrates nor sanitizes what it represents, positioning it clearly as an artifact of an evil regime, while allowing visitors to draw their own conclusions about what it means that such objects continue to fascinate and disturb in roughly equal measure. How does one look at something so beautiful and so terrible at the same time? The Canadian Museum's presentation of the car is an attempt to answer that question with thoughtfulness and historical integrity. Another surviving car with a remarkable and well-documented history is the example now held by the Lauman Museum in The Hague, in the Netherlands. This museum, which houses one of the finest private automotive collections in the world, acquired its Grosser Mercedes through a chain of ownership that stretches back to the immediate post-war period. The Lumen car is another 770K of the W150 series, and it is notable for being in exceptionally well-preserved mechanical condition, having been maintained over the decades in a manner that has kept its original systems largely intact. The museum presents the car as a historical artifact within the broader context of its automotive history collection, balancing the undeniable historical significance of the vehicle against the aesthetic and engineering values that make it genuinely remarkable as an automobile, quite apart from its association with Hitler. the question of what happens when these cars come to the open market is one that has generated some of the most heated debates in the world of automotive collecting. The answer, it turns out, is that they sell for extraordinary prices, attracting both genuine collectors with deep pockets and considerable controversy about whether it is appropriate for such objects to be bought and sold at all. The most significant public auction of a Hitler-era Mercedes in recent decades took place in January 2018, when a 1939 Mercedes-Benz 77OK Grosser open touring car went under the hammer at the Barrett-Jackson auction in Scottsdale, Arizona. The car had a documented history as one of the vehicles used in Hitler's fleet, though the precise details of its provenance have been, like those of most of these cars, a matter of ongoing historical discussion. The sale attracted enormous attention, with bidders competing in a packed auction tent while media from around the world reported on proceedings. When the hammer finally fell, the winning bid was $7,500,000 before the buyer's premium, making it one of the most expensive automobiles ever sold at public auction in the United States at that time. Including the premium, the total price paid was approximately $10 million. The sale provoked immediate and intense debate. On one side were those who argued that cars like this are legitimate historical artifacts, no different in principle from any other object associated with the Nazi regime, and that restricting their sale would serve no useful historical or moral purpose, while potentially driving them into the shadows where they would receive even less responsible stewardship. On the other side were those who found the spectacle of bidders competing enthusiastically for Hitler's car in a festive auction environment deeply inappropriate, a kind of accidental celebration of an object that should be in a museum, carefully contextualized rather than a trophy for a wealthy, private buyer. The debate is unlikely ever to be fully resolved because it touches on genuinely difficult questions about the nature of historical objects, the ethics of collecting, and the complex psychology of fascination with the artifacts of evil. The buyer of the Barrett-Jackson car chose to remain anonymous, which itself generated considerable speculation. Some observers suggested that the buyer was a museum or institution that intended to put the car on public display in an appropriate context. Others suggested that private collectors of this scale typically prefer anonymity to avoid the controversy that comes with publicly owning such a vehicle. Whatever the buyer's identity and intentions, the sale established a benchmark for what authentic, well-documented Hitler-era Mercedes Tourers are worth in the 21st century marketplace. A figure that is both extraordinary and somewhat unsettling in what it implies about the market for objects associated with the Third Reich. But let us step back for a moment and follow the specific stories of individual cars more carefully, because the individual histories are where the most remarkable details are found. One of the most extraordinary post-war journeys undergone by any of Hitler's vehicles involves the car that General George S. Patton, one of the most celebrated and controversial American commanders of the Second World War, briefly used as his personal transport in the weeks following Germany's surrender. Patton, who had led the Third Army in its dramatic sweep across France and into Germany, arrived in the Bavarian area in the final days of the war and quickly acquired a captured German vehicle for his own use. The story of Patton using a captured Grosser Mercedes has been repeated in numerous accounts of the post-war period, though the precise identification of which specific vehicle he used has predictably been a matter of some confusion in the historical record. What is well established is that Patton had a complicated and somewhat contradictory attitude toward Germany and the Germans that would shortly lead to his dismissal from command. He had publicly expressed views suggesting that former Nazis should be reintegrated into German administration more quickly than Allied policy allowed, views that caused an enormous scandal and ultimately cost him his command in October 1945, just months after Germany's surrender. In this context, his use of a captured German vehicle sits in an interesting position. Was it the trophy use of a defeated enemy's property? Or was it something more equivocal? Patton's own personality, with its theatrical self-presentation and love of dramatic historical gesture, makes it difficult to know for certain. He was a man who wore ivory-handled pistols and quoted Julius Caesar. Riding in Hitler's car was exactly the kind of grand symbolic statement he might have made quite deliberately. The connection between Patton and the captured Mercedes fleet is one of many threads that tie American military figures to these vehicles in the immediate post-war period. Beyond Patton, numerous other American officers took advantage of the extraordinary supply of high-quality German vehicles that the collapse of the Third Reich made available. Staff cars, sports cars, touring cars that had belonged to Nazi officials were commandeered throughout the American occupation zone, used briefly, and then passed along in chains of custody that are often impossible to reconstruct fully today. The Grosser Mercedes Tourers were at the top of this hierarchy of desirable captured vehicles, and it is no surprise that the competition for them was intense. What is perhaps more surprising is how quickly some of these vehicles made the transition from trophies of war to commercial commodities, beginning the long process by which they eventually entered the auction market and private collections. One of the fascinating subplots of the Hitler Mercedes story involves the vehicles that were not from the Berchtesgaden collection but had been assigned to other locations or other uses. The fleet was never concentrated at a single location. Different cars were assigned to different residences and used for different purposes. The Führerbegleitkommando maintained vehicles at the Berlin Reich Chancellery for day-to-day use in the capital, at the Wolfslair Field Headquarters in East Prussia for use during Hitler's extended periods at that location, and at the Berghof in Bavaria. As Germany's military situation deteriorated, cars were moved, sometimes in confusion and haste, between these various locations. Some were destroyed in Allied bombing raids. Others were commandeered by various SS and Wehrmacht units in the chaos of the final collapse. The result was a scattered diaspora of vehicles, each with its own story and each with its own claim to connection with the Third Reich's leadership. Among the most interesting of the peripheral vehicles are those that had been used not by Hitler himself but by other senior Nazi leaders, vehicles that nevertheless carry the same aura of historical horror and fascination as the Führer's own cars. Hermann Göring, the Reich Marshal and commander of the Luftwaffe, was one of the most extravagant and flamboyant figures in the Nazi leadership, a man whose personal excess became increasingly grotesque as the war turned against Germany. Göring's personal vehicle collection was, if anything, even more diverse than Hitler's, reflecting his broader habits of acquisition and display. He owned several Grosser Mercedes models himself, along with a variety of other luxury vehicles that he had either purchased or simply appropriated from conquered territories. Göring's cars were captured by Allied forces along with his art collection, his jewellery, and the other extraordinary accumulation of wealth that he had assembled during his years at the pinnacle of Nazi power. The story of how Göring's vehicles were handled after the war follows a pattern broadly similar to that of Hitler's cars, with the important difference that Göring himself was alive, captured, and eventually put on trial at Nuremberg, giving the story a personal dimension that Hitler's post-mortem fate did not provide. The sight of the once magnificent Reich Marshal, stripped of his uniform and medals and sitting in the dock at Nuremberg, was one of the defining images of the post-war accounting. Göring conducted his own defence with considerable skill and theatrical flair, demonstrating the intelligence and political instinct that had made him one of the most formidable figures in the Nazi hierarchy. But the verdict was never in doubt. He was found guilty on all 4 counts, including crimes against humanity and crimes against peace, and was sentenced to death by hanging. On October 15, 1946, just hours before his scheduled execution, Göring cheated the hangman by swallowing a cyanide capsule that had been smuggled to him, dying in his cell at Nuremberg. The vehicles he had once owned, like those of his leader, had already begun their separate journeys through the post-war world. The disposition of Nazi property in the immediate post-war period was governed by a complex and often inconsistently applied set of rules and practices. Allied military government authorities were nominally responsible for inventorying and controlling all property seized from the Nazi state and its officials. In practice, the chaotic conditions of occupied Germany made this an impossibly difficult task. Soldiers helped themselves to souvenirs, officers claimed vehicles and other valuables as legitimate trophies of war, and a thriving black market in looted goods developed almost immediately. In this environment, the fate of any specific vehicle depended enormously on which unit happened to find it, who commanded that unit, and what decisions they made in the moment. Some vehicles were formally requisitioned and documented. Others simply disappeared into private hands and were never officially recorded at all. This created the situation that still confronts historians and collectors today, a body of surviving vehicles, each of which may or may not be exactly what it is claimed to be, with chains of custody that are sometimes meticulously documented and sometimes almost entirely opaque. The problem is compounded by the fact that these are extraordinarily valuable objects. A fully authenticated Hitler-era Grosser Mercedes is worth millions of dollars, creating an enormous commercial incentive to exaggerate or fabricate connections to the Führer. The automotive world, like the world of fine art, has its forgers and its fraudsters, and the Hitler Mercedes represents exactly the kind of rare, valuable, and emotionally charged object that attracts them. Separating the genuine articles from the misrepresented ones is a task that has occupied automotive historians for decades and is still not complete. The problem of authentication is made particularly acute by the fact that Mercedes-Benz produced a relatively large number of 770 WW2 vehicles by comparison with, say, the total number of aircraft that Hitler actually flew in or chairs that he actually sat in. 88 cars were produced over a 5-year period. Not all of them were associated with Hitler personally, and not all of those that were associated with him were among his innermost personal fleet. But the narrative value of saying this is Hitler's car is so immense that there is a powerful temptation among sellers and even among some historians to inflate the connection beyond what the evidence actually supports. This is not to say that the surviving cars are fraudulent. Several of them have excellent documentation and genuine connections to the Nazi leadership. But the general principle is one that anyone approaching this subject needs to keep firmly in mind. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and in the murky world of post-war captured property, extraordinary evidence is not always available. What became of the fleet in its entirety? This is a question that draws together all the threads of the story, and the honest answer is that we cannot give a complete accounting. Of the 88 W150s produced, a significant number were destroyed during the war, either by Allied bombing, by deliberate destruction by retreating German forces, or by the inevitable entropy of machinery abandoned in the chaos of defeat. Some were used briefly by Allied forces and then simply disposed of when they became inconvenient, scrapped for parts or left to deteriorate in storage facilities. A few found their way to other countries as diplomatic gifts or through sale by occupation authorities, ending up in collections as far afield as South America, where several Latin American nations that had maintained close relations with Nazi Germany received various forms of German property as part of the complex post-war redistribution. And some, the most fortunate in terms of preservation, passed into the hands of private collectors or institutions that recognized their historical significance and took steps to maintain them properly. Among the American soldiers and officers who encountered these vehicles in 1945, the reactions varied enormously. For some, the cars were primarily trophies, tangible evidence of victory over a defeated enemy. For others, particularly those who had liberated concentration camps or witnessed the human cost of the Nazi regime at close quarters, there was something deeply uncomfortable about the beauty and elegance of these machines, a sense that their magnificence represented a kind of obscenity, the luxury of a regime built on mass murder. These emotional responses, which were articulated in the letters and diaries of American soldiers from the period, provide a human counterpoint to the more purely material story of what happened to the vehicles. The cars were not just objects, they were moral provocations, and the people who encountered them were forced to grapple with reactions that did not fit neatly into any simple framework. The official American military policy toward captured German property in the immediate post-war period was, in theory, governed by clear rules about what could be retained, what had to be turned in, and what would happen to high-value items of particular historical significance. In practice, the application of these rules was uneven and often inconsistent, particularly in the period immediately following Germany's surrender when the military command structure was still adjusting to the realities of occupation rather than combat. Senior officers had considerably more latitude than enlisted men to retain captured items as personal souvenirs, and the definition of what constituted a legitimate trophy versus improperly retained enemy property was frequently interpreted generously in favor of those with rank and connections. The war bond tours that used the Hitler Mercedes in 1945 and 1946 represent one of the most striking examples of the American government using captured enemy property as a propaganda and fundraising tool. The mechanics of these tours were elaborate and carefully organized. The cars were transported on specially designed trailers, since driving them freely on American roads would have been impractical given their size, weight, and the condition of some of the vehicles after years of storage in European garages. At each tour stop, A stage or display area was set up, sometimes with accompanying exhibits of other captured German and Japanese material. Military personnel in uniform were often present to provide context and to manage the crowds that invariably gathered. Admission fees or war bond purchases were charged, and the proceeds went to the ongoing war effort, though by late 1945 the Pacific War had already ended, and the war effort had shifted to other forms of national expenditure. The public response to these exhibitions provides a remarkable snapshot of American attitudes toward Germany and the Nazis in the immediate post-war period. The crowds who came to see Hitler's cars were often intensely curious, but also often intensely hostile toward the car itself and what it represented, an interesting projection of political emotion onto an inanimate object. Newspaper reports from the period describe visitors spitting on the vehicle, making gestures of contempt toward it, and occasionally attempting to damage it, only to be restrained by the military personnel managing the event. Others took photographs, bought souvenirs, and generally treated the occasion as a kind of dark tourist attraction. The combination of fascination and revulsion that characterized public engagement with these cars in 1945 is remarkably similar to the reaction they still provoke today, suggesting that something fundamental in the human response to objects associated with historical evil has remained relatively stable across the decades. The question of what specific message the American government intended to convey by staging these exhibitions is worth examining. The official framing was straightforwardly triumphalist. Here is the car of the man you defeated, evidence of his excess and his hubris, proof that American arms and American values had prevailed over tyranny. This framing served the immediate political purposes of the post-war period very well, but it also implicitly presented the car as a symbol of Nazi personal excess, rather than as evidence of a systematic program of mass murder, a framing that minimized the deeper horror of what the car's owner had done in favor of a more comfortable narrative about luxury versus democratic simplicity. This tension between different possible framings of Nazi material culture is one that continues to shape how these objects are presented and interpreted today. The mechanics who were assigned to maintain the cars during the American war bond tours faced their own peculiar set of challenges. These were vehicles that had been designed and built to exacting German specifications, maintained by a dedicated team of German mechanics using German parts and German procedures. Now they were in the hands of American military mechanics who might have excellent general automotive skills, but who had never worked on a WW2 and who had no access to the original maintenance manuals or spare parts. Some of the minor mechanical issues that arose during the tour were handled with improvised solutions that would have made the original Kemker mechanics wince. The fact that the cars continued to function at all, given the improvised nature of their maintenance, is a testament to the durability of their original construction. The most significant of the American custodians of the Hitler Mercedes during and after the war bond tours was a fascinating figure named John Egan, a private collector from Buffalo, New York, who acquired at least one of the large W150 Tourers and kept it for several decades before eventually selling it at auction. Egan's acquisition of the car, which apparently occurred through one of the complex chains of private sale that characterized the dispersal of war surplus material in the late 1940s, was the kind of transaction that would not have been possible in later decades, when the regulatory environment around transfers of historically significant material had become more complex. In Egan's day, the car was simply a remarkable vehicle available for purchase at a price that reflected its historical associations and technical specifications, with no additional regulatory burden. He maintained it carefully over the years, using it occasionally for public events and displays while keeping it in private storage the rest of the time. The car that eventually emerged from his collection to enter the auction market had been reasonably well preserved, though decades of storage had taken their inevitable toll on some of its systems and finishes. The subsequent auction careers of the various Hitler Mercedes provide some of the most dramatic financial data in the history of the collector car market. Before the 2018 Barrett-Jackson sale that achieved approximately $10 million, earlier sales of Hitler-associated Mercedes had established progressively higher benchmarks. A sale in the late 1970s had attracted considerable attention when a W150 Tourer sold for a price that was at the time among the highest ever achieved for an automobile. Further sales in the 1980s and 1990s pushed the record higher still, and with each successive sale the media coverage became more intense and the ethical debates became more heated. The trend in prices has been consistently upward, and there is no obvious reason to expect this to change in the near future, particularly as the historical distance from the Nazi period continues to increase and the supply of authenticated examples remains fixed. The parallel market for other Nazi-era vehicles and automotive memorabilia is worth noting in this context because it provides a broader landscape within which the Hitler-Mercedes story sits. Mercedes-Benz was not the only manufacturer to supply vehicles to the Nazi leadership, and it was certainly not the only manufacturer to have its vehicles used prominently in Nazi ceremonies and propaganda. Volkswagen, whose very origins lie in the Nazi period as Hitler's pet project for a people's car, has its own complex history with the Third Reich. The first Volkswagen prototypes were displayed to Hitler himself, and the company's founding is inseparable from the Nazi project of social transformation. Original pre-war Volkswagen Beetles with documented Nazi-era histories also appear occasionally on the collector market, though they attract considerably less monetary attention than the grosser Mercedes, partly because they are less rare and partly because their association with the Nazi elite is less direct. Mercedes-Benz's own post-war relationship with the history of its vehicles from the Nazi period has evolved considerably over time. In the immediate post-war decades, the company was understandably reluctant to draw attention to the association between its most prestigious vehicles and the most reviled regime in modern history. The commercial logic was clear. Rebuilding the Mercedes brand after the war required positioning it as a symbol of West German prosperity, quality, and reliability, not as a reminder of its intimate involvement with the Third Reich. This was a posture that many German corporations adopted in the early decades of the Federal Republic, when the priority was economic reconstruction, and the processes of official denazification were, in many eyes, being managed with more attention to economic practicality than moral thoroughness. As German society began to reckon more seriously with the Nazi period, particularly from the late 1960s onward as the post-war generation came of age and began asking uncomfortable questions about their parents' and grandparents' complicity, companies like Daimler-Benz were forced to engage more directly with their own histories. The commissioned historical study of the 1990s represented the most thorough of these engagements, and it has been followed by ongoing archival work and educational programs that Daimler has supported in various ways. The company's current official position acknowledges forthrightly the deep entanglement of its predecessor companies with the Nazi regime, including the use of forced labor, and positions this acknowledgement as part of the company's ongoing commitment to historical responsibility. Whether this corporate engagement represents a genuinely complete reckoning or a carefully managed public relations exercise is a question that historians and critics continue to debate. The connection between the surviving Hitler Mercedes and the ongoing commercial success of the Mercedes-Benz brand is itself a somewhat uncomfortable irony. The three-pointed star that appears on the hood ornament of every new Mercedes-Benz produced today is the same emblem that appeared on the vehicles that carried Hitler through his years of triumph. The brand's current prestige, which is among the highest of any automotive manufacturer in the world, rests in part on a legacy of engineering excellence that was demonstrated and celebrated during the Nazi period in the magnificent grosser Mercedes Tourers that are now museum pieces and auction lots. There is no simple or comfortable way to process this connection. It is simply part of the complex reality of how historical associations work, how brands accumulate meaning over time, and how the prestige of the present is always built on foundations that include both the admirable and the terrible. The current state of knowledge about surviving Hitler-era Mercedes vehicles identifies approximately 5 to 8 examples that can be considered reliably authentic, meaning vehicles with documented histories that credibly connect them to the fleet operated for Hitler and other senior Nazi leaders. Each of these cars has its own story, and taken together they form a kind of fragmented map of how the material legacy of the Third Reich has been handled, contested, and debated in the 8 decades since Germany's defeat. Let us look more carefully at some of the most significant individual cars and their post-war journeys, beginning with one of the most heavily documented and historically significant, the example that eventually went through the Barrett-Jackson auction process and achieved the headline price that shocked the collecting world. This car's post-war journey began at Berchtesgaden, where it was among the vehicles discovered by American forces in the first days of May 1945. Unlike some of the other vehicles, which were quickly Claimed by officers for personal use, this particular car was identified as having exceptional documentary importance and was treated with somewhat more care in the initial stages of its post-war life. Photographs were taken of it at Berchtesgaden by American military photographers, establishing a visual record of its location and condition in the immediate post-war period. These photographs, which show the car in the distinctive grey paint and with the characteristic armoured bodywork of the W150, became crucial pieces of documentation in establishing the car's provenance in subsequent decades. From Berchtesgaden, the car was moved under American military authority to a staging area in the Bavarian region, where it joined a number of other captured vehicles and items of military and historical significance. At this point in the story, the precise chain of custody becomes somewhat harder to trace in full detail, as was the case with so many captured items from this period. What is clear is that the car was eventually shipped to the United States, where it entered the custody of private parties who recognized its extraordinary value. Over the subsequent decades, it passed through several sets of hands, each time generating documentation that added another layer to its provenance history. By the time it came to the Barrett-Jackson sale in 2018, it had accumulated a paper trail sufficient to satisfy the auction house's standards for authentication, even if some individual elements of that history remained matters for scholarly discussion. The Barrett-Jackson sale itself was a remarkable event that deserves detailed examination because it crystallizes so many of the tensions and controversies surrounding these vehicles. Barrett-Jackson, one of the most prominent classic car auction houses in the world, is best known for its extravagant annual events in Scottsdale, Arizona, where classic American muscle cars and hot rods typically dominate the catalogue and the entertainment. The appearance of a Hitler-era grosser Mercedes in this setting was jarring to some observers, who felt that the festive, televised atmosphere of a Barrett-Jackson sale was an entirely inappropriate venue for an object of such dark historical weight. Critics pointed to the fact that, in the standard Barrett-Jackson presentation, the car's Nazi provenance was being treated as a selling point, a way of elevating its drama and desirability, rather than as a historical burden that required careful contextualization. Was the auction house essentially marketing the horror of Nazism as a consumer product? The question was uncomfortable and did not have an easy answer. Barrett-Jackson and the seller countered that the alternative, keeping such vehicles in private hands without public documentation or display, was worse from a historical and educational standpoint. By selling the car at a major public auction, they argued, they were ensuring that it would be seen, discussed, and forced into the public consciousness in a way that reminded people of the reality of the Nazi era. Whatever one thinks of this argument, the sale did generate an enormous amount of media coverage and public discussion about the car, its history, and the broader question of how society should relate to the material artifacts of historical evil. In this sense at least, the event achieved a kind of public education function. Even if the setting and framing were deeply controversial, the winning bidder, as noted, remained anonymous. This anonymity has fueled speculation that has never been fully resolved. Some automotive journalists and historians believe the car was purchased by a serious collector who intends to maintain it in appropriate private storage, potentially lending it to museum exhibitions from time to time. Others have suggested that the buyer is an institution that acquired it with the intention of eventual public display. Without confirmation from the buyer, all of this remains speculation. What is known is that the car changed hands for approximately $10 million, including the buyer's premium, and that it has not reappeared in the public domain in any documented way since the sale. The contrast between this outcome and the approach taken by the Canadian War Museum is instructive. The Canadian Museum made a deliberate choice to place its car in public view, to contextualize it clearly as a product of the Nazi regime, and to use it as an educational tool in a way that acknowledges both its historical significance and its moral weight. The museum does not celebrate the car. It does not present it as a trophy or as a testimony to German engineering excellence. It presents it as an artifact of a criminal state, an object that belonged to a man who was responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people, and it invites visitors to wrestle with the complex feelings that the object provokes. This approach has been widely praised by historians and educators as a model for how such objects should be handled, even if the practical challenges of managing public engagement with such a charged artifact are considerable. Another fascinating chapter in the story of these vehicles involves the South American connection. Argentina, Brazil, and several other Latin American nations had maintained complex relationships with Nazi Germany during the war, and after Germany's defeat, they became destinations of choice for a significant number of fleeing Nazis, as well as for various forms of German property that made its way out of the country through the rat lines and other smuggling networks. Among the material that moved through these channels were, according to some accounts, at least one and possibly more vehicles from Hitler's personal fleet. The South American connection is one of the most poorly documented aspects of the Mercedes story, precisely because the people involved in moving property through these networks had every reason to avoid leaving records, and because the governments of the countries involved were not inclined to cooperate with Allied investigations into the fate of German assets. What is known is that several Latin American countries received, through various channels, examples of the 770K that had connections to the Nazi leadership. One car that is frequently mentioned in this context, though the documentation is imperfect, is an example that ended up in Argentina in the late 1940s, a country that under Juan Perón had been notably sympathetic to Nazi Germany, and that received a disproportionate number of fleeing German war criminals. The car reportedly passed through several sets of hands in Argentina over the subsequent decades before being sold to a North American collector in the 1970s or 1980s, at which point it entered the mainstream collector car market with a provenance that was murky at best. Whether this particular vehicle can be connected definitively to Hitler's personal fleet is a question that historians have not been able to answer with certainty, and it serves as a reminder of how far the reach of the Third Reich's material legacy extends and how thoroughly it penetrated even the farthest corners of the post-war world. The ethical and legal questions surrounding the ownership of these vehicles are genuinely complex and have evolved significantly over the decades. In the immediate post-war period, the primary legal framework governing captured German property was the various occupation statutes and international agreements that allowed Allied military authorities to seize and dispose of Nazi state property. Under these frameworks, vehicles from Hitler's fleet were treated as enemy property subject to Allied disposition, and their transfer to American military custody and subsequent use or sale was considered legally straightforward. There was no specific legal prohibition on private ownership of these vehicles, and the American legal system has never enacted such a prohibition. In contrast, Germany itself has enacted laws prohibiting the display or distribution of Nazi symbols and artifacts in contexts that could be construed as celebrating or promoting National Socialism, though these laws have complex applications and are not generally interpreted as preventing museums from displaying authentic historical artifacts. The legal framework in other countries varies considerably. In France, there have been periodic debates about whether sales of Nazi memorabilia should be restricted or prohibited, and French auction houses have faced legal challenges over sales of items with clear Nazi connections. In the United States, the First Amendment tradition and the strong rights of private property ownership have generally kept the legal space for buying and selling such items very wide, though individual auction houses have adopted their own policies about what they will and will not sell. The moral debate, which is in many ways more important than the legal one, continues to evolve as society grapples with questions about historical memory, cultural sensitivity, and the appropriate relationship between commerce and historical horror. One angle that is sometimes overlooked in discussions of Hitler's cars is the perspective of the forced labourers who built them. The armoured 770K vehicles were produced at the Daimler-Benz factory complex in Stuttgart and at specialised coach-building firms, and like virtually all German industrial production in the later war years, this work was conducted in part by forced labourers, including concentration camp prisoners and workers forcibly transported from occupied territories. These men and women worked under brutal conditions, subjected to violence, inadequate food and housing, and the constant threat of death. Some died in the factories, others survived the war, and were eventually liberated by Allied forces. When we look at a surviving Hitler-era Mercedes today, we are looking not just at the product of German engineering excellence, but at the product of forced and slave labour, a fact that adds another layer of moral complexity to the already difficult question of how these objects should be regarded. Daimler-Benz AG, the company that became Daimler-Chrysler and is now simply Daimler AG, has engaged with this history more seriously than many German companies. In the 1990s, the company commissioned an independent historical study of its activities during the Nazi period, which was published in 1998 under the title Das Daimler-Benz Buch. The study found extensive evidence of the company's use of forced labor, its production of military vehicles and weapons, and its deep entanglement with the Nazi regime at multiple levels. The company subsequently established a foundation that made financial contributions to a broader German industry fund for compensation of former forced laborers, and it has been relatively forthcoming by German corporate standards in acknowledging this aspect of its history. This corporate engagement with the past is worth noting because it provides a different kind of context for the surviving vehicles than the one usually applied, connecting them not just to Hitler and his regime, but to the entire industrial and human system that produced them. The story of Hitler's Mercedes vehicles cannot be told without also addressing the remarkable number of fraudulent or misrepresented vehicles that have appeared on the market over the decades. The combination of extraordinary monetary value, difficult documentation, and intense public fascination has made the Hitler Mercedes an almost irresistible target for fraud and misrepresentation. Over the years, a number of vehicles have been offered for sale or displayed as former Hitler cars without adequate supporting evidence, and in some cases with documentation that subsequent investigation has shown to be fabricated or significantly exaggerated. The problem is compounded by the genuine complexity of establishing authenticity in this field, where the destruction of records during the war, the loss of direct witnesses, and the dispersal of documentation across multiple countries and archives makes definitive answers extremely difficult to obtain. One of the most notorious cases of misrepresentation in this field involves a vehicle that was widely promoted in the 1970s and 1980s as being Hitler's personal car, and that attracted significant media attention before closer examination revealed significant inconsistencies in its claimed provenance. The car in question bore some of the external characteristics of a W150 Grosser Mercedes, and had been fitted with some authentic period components, but detailed mechanical and documentary analysis suggested that it was not what it claimed to be. This case, which received considerable coverage in the specialized automotive press, sensitized the collecting community to the need for rigorous documentation and independent authentication before accepting claims about the provenance of any vehicle allegedly from Hitler's fleet. The auction houses that have handled these vehicles in recent decades have generally invested significantly in authentication processes, bringing in outside experts to examine the vehicles, review documentation, and provide independent assessments of their claimed histories. These processes have become increasingly sophisticated over time, drawing on advances in materials analysis, archival research, and comparative vehicle identification that were not available to earlier generations of researchers. Metallurgical analysis can in some cases help date steel components and determine whether they are consistent with wartime German production. Paint analysis can identify original finishes beneath later applications. Comparison of specific component details with factory records and period photographs can help establish or challenge claimed identities. None of these methods is infallible, and in the absence of definitive documentary proof, questions always remain. But the field has become considerably more rigorous than it was in the earlier decades when many of these vehicles first entered the market. What is the current market for these vehicles, and how does it reflect broader trends in the collecting of Nazi-era memorabilia? The honest answer is that it is robust and growing, despite, or perhaps in part because of, the ethical controversies surrounding it. As the generation that lived through the Second World War has passed, the objects of that era have taken on a different kind of significance for subsequent generations, one that combines historical fascination with a more purely aesthetic and collecting interest. For some buyers, a Hitler-era Mercedes is primarily a historical artifact, important for what it tells us about the Nazi period and worthy of preservation and study. For others, it is primarily a magnificent and rare automobile, one of the most extraordinary vehicles ever produced, and its association with the Nazi leadership is simply one element of its remarkable story. And for a small number of buyers, one must acknowledge honestly, the Nazi connection is itself a draw, an attraction rooted in a fascination with the aesthetics and power of the Third Reich that slides uncomfortably towards something darker and more troubling. the academic study of what has been called the fascination with fascism, and more specifically the curious appeal that Nazi aesthetics continues to exercise over some segments of the population, is a rich and important field that casts light on some of the deeper questions raised by the story of Hitler's cars. The Nazi regime was, among other things, a regime of extraordinary aesthetic self-consciousness, one that invested enormous resources in the visual presentation of its power. From Albert Speer's monumental architecture, to Leni Riefenstahl's cinema, to the precise choreography of the Nuremberg rallies, the Nazis understood that visual and aesthetic impact could be a powerful instrument of political control and popular mobilization. The Grosse Mercedes, with its combination of engineering excellence, visual grandeur, and association with absolute power, was a product of this same aesthetic consciousness, and it is not surprising that it continues to exercise a powerful hold on the imagination. This hold is not straightforward or uniform. For most people who are drawn to these vehicles, the fascination is part of a broader interest in the history of the period and does not reflect any sympathy with Nazi ideology. The challenge is that the line between historical fascination and something more troubling is not always clearly marked, and the commercial market for these objects does not always distinguish carefully between buyers who approach them with genuine historical seriousness and those whose interest is more ambiguous. Reputable auction houses and museums attempt to manage this through context and framing, presenting these objects in ways that acknowledge their horror rather than celebrating their power. Whether this framing is always sufficient to prevent their display and sale from serving as vehicles for a subtler form of Nazi nostalgia is a question that thoughtful people continue to debate. The role of the media in shaping public understanding of these vehicles is worth examining carefully. Every major auction of a Hitler-era Mercedes generates enormous media coverage, most of it framed in terms of the extraordinary price the car achieved and the drama of the bidding process. Headlines typically emphasize the price first and the historical context second, if at all, creating a framing in which the primary meaning of the event is the marketplace value of the object rather than its historical significance. This is a pattern common to media coverage of high-value auctions across many categories, but it has a particularly uncomfortable quality when applied to objects from the Nazi era. The message that a Hitler car is worth $10 million is not politically or morally neutral, and the media's default framing often obscures this. By contrast, academic and museum contexts tend to present these vehicles very differently, emphasizing their status as evidence of a historical moment rather than as objects of desire. The challenge is that the academic and museum framing reaches a much smaller audience than the commercial media coverage, and that for many people their primary exposure to these vehicles comes through the dramatic auction stories, rather than through carefully contextualized museum presentations. This imbalance in how different framings reach different audiences is a structural problem that is difficult to address within the existing institutional landscape. It is one reason why some historians and educators have argued that the most significant of these surviving vehicles should ideally be in public museum collections rather than in private hands, where at least some measure of control over framing and context is possible. The specific technical analysis of the surviving Hitler-era Mercedes vehicles that has been conducted by automotive experts over the years provides a layer of detail that is worth exploring more carefully, because it illustrates both the extraordinary quality of the original manufacturing and the challenges of establishing authenticity in this specialized field. The W150 Grosse Mercedes was built to a standard of engineering precision that was unusual even for the most expensive vehicles of its era. The tolerances to which the engine components were machined, the quality of the materials used in the chassis and bodywork, and the sophistication of the design all reflect a level of investment in quality that was, in commercial terms, essentially independent of cost, since these cars were government orders and price was not the primary concern of the purchaser. When automotive engineers examine surviving W150 vehicles today, they look for a specific set of physical characteristics that are consistent with the known production methods of the period. The metallurgy of the engine block and cylinder head, the specific alloy compositions used in various components, the casting marks and machining marks that were characteristic of the Daimler-Benz production process of the late 1930s and early 1940s, all of these details can be examined and compared against the factory records and against other authenticated examples. The armouring material is another area of particular interest, since the steel alloys used for the armour plate were specialised formulations that have a chemical signature distinguishable from later materials, and the laminated glass used for the bulletproof windows was produced to specific specifications that are detectable through materials analysis. This kind of forensic automotive analysis has been applied to several of the claimed Hitler-era examples with varying results. In some cases, the physical evidence has strongly supported the claimed provenance, finding materials and construction details entirely consistent with the known production history of the specific vehicle, as identified by its chassis number. In other cases, the analysis has revealed anomalies that suggest the vehicle has been significantly modified since its manufacture, or that it may not be the vehicle it claims to be at all. The science is not infallible, and the results are always interpreted in conjunction with the documentary evidence rather than in isolation. But it represents an important additional tool in the authentication process that was not available to earlier generations of researchers. The specific chassis numbers of the W150 vehicles produced for Hitler's fleet are known from the Mercedes-Benz production records, at least for those vehicles whose records survive. These numbers provide the most fundamental basis for authentication, since a vehicle with a chassis number that does not appear in the factory records, or that appears in the records as having been assigned to a use incompatible with the claimed history, cannot credibly be what it is claimed to be. Conversely, a vehicle whose chassis number matches a factory record entry that is consistent with its claimed history has cleared one important hurdle in the authentication process, though not the only one. The combination of a matching chassis number, consistent physical evidence, and supporting documentary evidence from other sources provides the strongest possible foundation for authentication. One of the most significant clusters of documented W150 vehicles from the Hitler fleet consists of the cars ordered in 1938 and 1939, the first years of production of the W150 series, and specifically those delivered to the German government in time to be used in the great propaganda ceremonies of that period. The invasion of Austria in March 1938, the subsequent triumph tour through Vienna, the occupation of the Sudetenland in October 1938, and then the full occupation of Czechoslovakia in March 1939 were all events at which the open tourers played prominent ceremonial roles, and the specific vehicles used at these events can in some cases be identified in the photographic and film record. When researchers can cross-reference these visual identifications with the factory records and with the known histories of surviving vehicles, they can sometimes make strong, well-supported arguments about the specific history of individual cars. The Vienna Triumph Tour of March 1938, which followed Germany's annexation of Austria and is often presented in historical accounts as one of the high points of Nazi popular success, provides a particularly well-documented example of the ceremonial use of the Grosse Mercedes fleet. The events surrounding the Anschluss were photographed and filmed extensively, both by official Nazi propaganda teams and by international press photographers, and the resulting visual record includes a large number of images showing Hitler in his open Mercedes moving through the ecstatic crowds that lined the Ringstrasse. These images have been examined in minute technical detail by researchers attempting to identify the specific vehicle or vehicles used, and certain details, including visible chassis features, registration marks, and bodywork characteristics, have been used to connect specific images with specific surviving vehicles. This is painstaking work that requires expertise in both automotive identification and historical photographic analysis, but it represents some of the most rigorous scholarship in this field. The question of what happened to the vehicles used at the major Nazi ceremonies of 1938 and 1939, specifically the grand public appearances that represented the high point of Nazi triumphalism before the war, is one that connects the story of the cars to the broader historical narrative of the Nazi period in a particularly vivid way. These were the machines at the centre of the most carefully staged political theatre in modern history, vehicles whose public appearances were choreographed by Goebbels' propaganda ministry to achieve specific emotional effects on specific audiences. The fact that some of these same vehicles now sit in museum display cases or private garages is a historical irony of considerable power. They outlived the regime they served, the ideology they represented, and most of the people who rode in them or watched them pass. By the time the Second World War broke out in September 1939, the Grand Parade use of the cars was already beginning to shift toward more functional military and command uses, though the symbolic importance of the Grosse Mercedes as a visual shorthand for German power and Hitler's personal authority was still regularly deployed. When Hitler entered Warsaw following Poland's defeat in October 1939, he was photographed in an open Mercedes Tourer, the imagery carefully capturing the parallel between the victorious commander and his magnificent vehicle against the backdrop of the conquered city. Similar imagery followed Germany's other early military victories, each carefully staged to maximize the propagandistic impact of the combination of Hitler, his car, and the physical evidence of German military triumph. The Paris visit of June 1940 deserves particular attention as perhaps the most dramatically charged of all these ceremonial uses of the Mercedes fleet. Hitler's early morning tour of the captured French capital, arranged at his personal insistence and conducted with extraordinary secrecy for security reasons, used at least one and possibly two of his armoured W150 vehicles, which had been driven to France along with the military units that had completed the conquest. The photographs and film footage from that morning, showing Hitler standing outside the Paris Opera and gazing at the Eiffel Tower, are among the most famous images of the entire war, and the Mercedes vehicles visible in some of the wider shots are almost certainly among the cars whose post-war histories have been most intensely investigated by automotive historians. Whether any of the specific vehicles present in Paris that morning survives today in an authenticated form is a question that remains open, but the possibility that one or more of them does survive adds another layer of historical resonance to the story of the surviving fleet. The Italian connection is another underexplored dimension of the Hitler-Mercedes story. Hitler made several visits to Italy as part of his political relationship with Mussolini, and on at least some of these occasions his own vehicles were transported to Italy for the visits, while on other occasions he used Italian state vehicles provided by his host. The question of which specific cars were transported to Italy and what happened to those vehicles subsequently is one that Italian automotive historians have occasionally addressed, but that has not received the same level of detailed international scholarship as some other aspects of the story. It is possible that one or more vehicles from the Hitler fleet entered Italian circulation during or after the war through channels connected to these diplomatic visits, though this remains largely speculative without better documentation. The Japanese connection is better documented in some respects, if no less complex. Several 770K vehicles of both the W07 and W150 series were exported to Japan as state gifts during the period of the German-Japanese alliance, and these vehicles were used by the Japanese imperial household and government for various ceremonial purposes during the war years. Unlike the German vehicles, whose post-war fate was determined by the German defeat, the Japanese examples survived the end of the Pacific War in contexts that reflected Japan's own post-war situation. Some were reportedly destroyed or damaged in Allied bombing raids. Others survived and eventually entered Japanese collections, where they have been maintained with the meticulous care that is characteristic of the Japanese approach to the preservation of important historical vehicles. At least one W150 with documented Japanese imperial connections is believed to be in a Japanese museum collection, though access for Western researchers has been limited. The story returns repeatedly to the question of what it means to own these objects, and whether ownership necessarily implies a form of endorsement or celebration of what they represent. This question is particularly acute for private collectors, who do not have the institutional framework and educational mission of a museum to provide context and legitimacy for their ownership. A private individual who owns a Hitler-era Mercedes is necessarily making some kind of statement by that ownership, whether they intend to or not, and navigating the social and reputational implications of that ownership is not straightforward. Some collectors have chosen simply not to publicize their ownership of these vehicles, keeping them in private storage and neither selling them nor lending them for public display. Others have been more open about their ownership, participating in historical research projects and making their vehicles available for scholarly examination, positioning themselves as stewards of historical artifacts rather than collectors of trophies. The economics of the Hitler Mercedes market also involve the broader ecosystem of related memorabilia and artifacts that surrounds the specific category of major vehicles. Mercedes-Benz accessories, components, and documentation associated with Hitler's fleet have their own market, which is smaller in absolute terms, but shares many of the same ethical and commercial characteristics as the market for the vehicles themselves. Items that have been documented as having been in or on Hitler's cars, from original spare parts to documentation from Kempke's files to photographs taken inside the vehicles, all command premium prices from collectors willing to pay for an authentic connection to the darkest chapter of the 20th century. The ethical questions this raises are similar to those surrounding the cars themselves, though they rarely attract the same level of public attention because they are less visually spectacular. The question of forgery and fraud in this secondary memorabilia market is, if anything, more acute than in the market for the vehicles themselves, because the lower individual values involved make the economics of fraud potentially more attractive and the detection of fraud more difficult. An incorrectly attributed photograph or document can be created relatively easily and sold for a significant sum to a collector who lacks the expertise to detect the deception. The vehicles themselves are harder to fake convincingly, though, as described above, cases of misrepresentation and exaggerated provenance claims have certainly occurred. The broader market for Nazi memorabilia has been described by some researchers as one of the most fraud-prone areas of historical collecting, and while the major vehicles are somewhat insulated from this problem by their size and complexity, they are not entirely immune. The role of academic institutions in the study and authentication of Hitler-era vehicles is growing, though it remains less developed than one might expect given the historical significance of the subject. A handful of universities and research institutes have conducted specific projects examining aspects of the history of these vehicles, drawing on historical archives, technical analysis, and oral history. The Daimler-Benz Corporate Archive has collaborated with several academic institutions on specific research projects, and the results have been incorporated into both scholarly publications and public educational programs, but there is still no single comprehensive academic study that brings together all available evidence about the complete fleet in a way that provides a definitive reference work for researchers in the field. This gap in the scholarly literature is, in part, a reflection of the difficulty and sensitivity of the subject. It is also an opportunity for future scholarship. The story of Hitler's Mercedes does not end with the cars themselves. It extends outward to encompass the entire ecosystem of institutions, collectors, historians, and commercial interests that have grown up around these extraordinary objects in the 8 decades since Germany's defeat. Understanding this ecosystem requires looking at several additional dimensions of the story that have not yet been fully addressed, including the remarkable history of the fleet's management during the war years, the specific fate of individual cars that have been traced through the historical record with particular care, and the ongoing work of researchers who continue to add to our knowledge of these vehicles and their provenance. One of the most important figures in the management of Hitler's vehicle fleet, whose own post-war story is directly relevant to the history of the cars themselves, was the chauffeur Erich Kempke. Kempke's experience in the final days of the war was extraordinary, even by the extreme standards of what was happening in Berlin in late April 1945. He was present in the Führer bunker during the final days, and on April 30th, 1945, he was one of a small group of individuals who carried Hitler's body from the bunker to the Reich Chancellery Garden and helped to burn it, following the instructions that Hitler had given in anticipation of his suicide. Kempke then attempted to escape from Berlin in the chaos of the Soviet assault, an attempt that very nearly cost him his life. He was captured by American forces in June 1945 in Austria and was initially treated as a material witness to the events in the bunker, including the fate of Hitler's body, which was the subject of enormous official interest. Kempke was extensively interrogated by Allied intelligence officers about his role in the burning of Hitler's body and about what he knew of events in the bunker in the final days. His testimony, combined with that of other survivors, formed an important part of the early Allied understanding of Hitler's end, though subsequent historical research has identified some inconsistencies and inaccuracies in various accounts given by bunker survivors, including Kempke himself. After his initial period of interrogation and detention, Kempke was released and went on to live a relatively quiet life in West Germany, writing a memoir about his years as Hitler's chauffeur that was published in 1950. The memoir, while providing valuable first-hand detail about life in Hitler's immediate circle, is also a document of the self-serving post-war narrative that many former Nazi functionaries constructed for themselves, acknowledging their proximity to Hitler while minimizing their complicity in his regime. Kempe died in Berchtesgaden in 1975, taking much of his detailed knowledge of the vehicle fleet with him. The vehicles that Kempe managed so carefully for over a decade had by that point been scattered across the world for 30 years, each pursuing its own complex trajectory through the post-war decades. But Kempe's knowledge of the fleet's specific details, including the chassis numbers, registration marks, and individual characteristics of specific vehicles, would have been invaluable in resolving many of the authentication questions that have bedeviled researchers subsequently. That this knowledge died with him is one of the irretrievable losses in the historical record of these vehicles. Contemporary researchers working on authentication questions must rely instead on the Mercedes-Benz factory records, on contemporary photographs and newsreel footage, on the accounts of various Allied officers and soldiers who encountered the vehicles in 1945, and on the physical evidence provided by the surviving cars themselves. The Mercedes-Benz factory records, which are maintained in the company's archive in Stuttgart and have been made available to researchers on a limited basis, provide the most authoritative documentary foundation for the history of the 770K fleet. These records include order books, production records, chassis numbers, and in some cases specification sheets that describe the particular configurations of individual vehicles. Cross-referencing these records with the known histories of surviving cars is the primary methodology for authentication, but it is a process that requires careful and patient archival work and is subject to the limitations imposed by the destruction and dispersal of records during the war. Some records survive in excellent condition, others are partial, damaged, or simply missing. The archive is an invaluable resource, but it cannot by itself answer all the questions that researchers bring to it. One dimension of the Mercedes story that deserves particular attention is the fate of the cars that were used not for Hitler's public appearances, but for his private travel, the enclosed saloon versions that transported him between residences with less visibility than the open tourers. These vehicles were, in some respects, even more intimately associated with Hitler's daily existence than the parade cars, since they were the machines in which he actually travelled, often at high speed over long distances, for much of the period between 1938 and the end of the war. The enclosed saloon versions of the W150 are less dramatically spectacular than the open tourers, lacking the theatrical visual impact of the cars from which Hitler conducted his famous parades, but they are in some ways more historically interesting as evidence of the realities of daily life in Hitler's entourage. Several enclosed W150 saloons are known to have survived the war and entered post-war circulation. One example with a documented history is associated with the Führerhauptquartier, the shifting military headquarters from which Hitler directed the later stages of the war. This car was used for local travel in the vicinity of whatever headquarters location was currently active, whether the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Werwolf in Ukraine, or one of the other field command posts that Hitler inhabited during the active years of the war. Its history is less glamorous than that of the parade tourers, but it is in some ways more instructive about the mundane realities of the Nazi command structure. When this vehicle was eventually captured by Allied forces and entered the post-war collecting world, it did so without the dramatic visual associations of the open cars, and consequently commanded a somewhat lower price and generated somewhat less controversy, even though its historical connection to Hitler's personal use was arguably as direct as that of the more celebrated tourers. The international dimension of the surviving fleet is worth exploring further, because the cars spread far more widely than most people realize. Beyond the American and Canadian examples already discussed, and beyond the South American vehicles mentioned in connection with the Nazi rat lines, examples of the 770K are known to have reached several European countries through various channels. Finland, which had a complex wartime relationship with Nazi Germany as a co-belligerent against the Soviet Union, received at least one Grosser Mercedes as a diplomatic gift. Japan, Germany's Axis ally in the Pacific, also received examples of the 770K as state gifts, though the fate of these vehicles in the destruction of the Pacific War is largely unknown. Several European neutral countries, including Sweden and Switzerland, are known to have received or retained vehicles with connections to the Nazi leadership through channels that reflected the complex economic and diplomatic relationships of the wartime period. The Swedish example is particularly interesting. Sweden maintained its neutrality throughout the war, but had extensive commercial relationships with Germany, including significant iron ore exports that were crucial to German war production. In this context, Various forms of luxury goods and prestige items move between Germany and Sweden through legitimate commercial channels, and it is possible that at least one 770K reached Swedish hands through such a channel during or shortly after the war. Swedish automotive historians have traced several large Mercedes vehicles of the appropriate period that have resided in Swedish collections, though the documentation connecting them to the Nazi leadership is in most cases incomplete. Sweden's own historical reckoning with its wartime role has evolved significantly in recent decades, and questions about German property that entered the country during this period are part of a broader national conversation about neutrality, complicity, and historical responsibility. The most recently documented major development in the history of Hitler's Mercedes fleet is the growing body of academic and journalistic work that has attempted to bring greater clarity to the overall picture of what survives, where the surviving vehicles are located, and what can be established about their provenance. A number of researchers have spent years working through archives in multiple countries, examining surviving vehicles in person, and consulting with Mercedes-Benz historians to build as complete a picture as possible. This work is slow, painstaking, and often inconclusive, but it is gradually improving the state of knowledge and helping to distinguish between the genuine survivors and the misrepresented or fraudulent ones. The results of this research have been mixed. On one hand, several vehicles previously claimed to be authentic Hitler-era cars have been conclusively shown to have histories that do not support those claims, either because their chassis numbers do not match any known Hitler fleet vehicles, or because their construction details are inconsistent with the period and specifications, or because the documentary evidence supporting their claimed provenance has been shown to be fabricated or unreliable. This work of debunking is important and valuable because it prevents the market and the historical record from being contaminated by false information. On the other hand, the same research has also strengthened the cases for several vehicles that were previously doubted, finding documentary and physical evidence that supports their claimed identities in ways that were not previously recognized. The community of collectors, historians, and enthusiasts who take a serious interest in these vehicles is a remarkably diverse and in some ways unlikely group. It includes automotive historians who approach the subject primarily from a technical and documentary perspective, treating the cars as engineering artifacts whose significance lies in what they tell us about the state of automotive technology in the late 1930s. It includes Second World War historians who are interested in the cars as material evidence of the Nazi regime's self-presentation and the role of technology in Nazi political culture. It includes collectors who prize rarity, craftsmanship, and historical provenance above everything else, and who see the 770K as simply one of the greatest automobiles ever built. And it includes a smaller but not negligible group whose interest in Nazi-era material is less historically serious and more morally troubling. Managing this diversity of interests and motivations, and ensuring that the objects themselves are treated with the seriousness and respect that their historical significance demands, is an ongoing challenge for everyone involved. Museums that hold these vehicles face a particular set of challenges in deciding how to present them to the public. The Canadian War Museum's approach, which emphasizes the car's connection to an evil regime and invites visitors to reflect on the historical context, is one model. Other institutions have taken different approaches, some more and some less successful, in navigating the competing demands of historical accuracy, educational effectiveness, and public accessibility. The challenge of presenting objects that are simultaneously remarkable examples of craftsmanship and indisputable instruments of totalitarian imagery is not unique to these cars. Museums around the world grapple with similar questions about how to present artifacts from the Nazi period and from other episodes of historical evil. But the sheer scale and visual impact of the Grosse Mercedes makes the challenge particularly acute and the stakes particularly high. One approach that several institutions have found effective is to place the car in dialogue with other artifacts and testimonies that provide context for its significance. When a 770K Tourer is displayed alongside photographs of the events at which it was used, alongside testimonies from survivors of Nazi persecution, and alongside historical analysis of the role of spectacle and aesthetics in Nazi political culture, it becomes a much richer and more educational object than when it is simply presented in isolation as a remarkable automobile. This contextual approach requires more curatorial resources and more space than a simple display, but the educational payoff is substantially greater, and it helps to prevent the car from being experienced primarily as a trophy or a glamour object. The story of the individual mechanics and craftsmen who built these extraordinary vehicles is another dimension that is rarely explored, but is deeply relevant to a full understanding of what these objects are. The workers at the Daimler-Benz factory in Stuttgart who assembled the 150 production run were doing their jobs in a society where refusal was not really an option, where the Nazi state permeated every aspect of working life, and where the alternative to compliance was severe. Many of these workers were ordinary Germans who had no particular enthusiasm for the Nazi regime, but who had families to feed and livelihoods to protect. Some were genuine supporters of the regime and took pride in building magnificent vehicles for the Führer. Some were forced labourers with no choice in the matter at all. The cars that survive today bear the work of all these hands, and this human dimension of their manufacture is part of their historical meaning, even if it is rarely foregrounded in discussions of their value or their provenance. The highly skilled coach builders who fitted the custom bodywork to these cars, the armourers who installed the specialised protection systems, the electricians who wired the complex electrical systems, the upholsterers who fitted the interiors in the finest leather and wool, all of these craftspeople contributed their skills to objects that were ultimately in the service of one of the worst regimes in history. Their work is still visible today in the surviving vehicles, in the precision of the panel fits, the quality of the leather, the solidity of the door mechanisms, and the integrity of the mechanical systems. It is extraordinary work, produced under extraordinary circumstances, and it raises its own uncomfortable questions about the relationship between craft, beauty, and moral context. What does the future hold for these remarkable and troubling vehicles? Several trajectories seem likely. The most significant surviving examples, those with the best documentation and the clearest connections to Hitler's personal fleet, will almost certainly continue to appreciate in monetary value, particularly as they age into the category of truly irreplaceable historical objects. The supply is fixed and finite, the demand is robust, and the historical significance only increases with time. This financial trajectory will continue to make them attractive targets for commercial activity, whether through auction sales, insurance valuations, or the various forms of commercial exploitation that attach to highly valuable objects. At the same time, the growing sophistication of authentication research and the increasing accessibility of archival resources mean that the historical understanding of these vehicles will continue to improve. Questions that are currently unresolved about specific cars and their provenance may be answered as additional archival material is processed and published. This is genuinely important work because the historical record of the Nazi period is a matter of global significance, and every improvement in our understanding of how its material legacy has been handled is a contribution to the broader project of historical accountability. The museum sector is likely to be an increasingly important custodian of these vehicles. As the generation of collectors who acquired many of these cars in the post-war decades passes, and as estates and collections are dispersed, there will be opportunities for institutions to acquire vehicles that have been in private hands. Whether those institutions have the resources and the curatorial commitment to acquire and properly present these objects will depend on a complex set of factors, including their own institutional priorities, their funding situations, and the level of public and scholarly demand for access to this kind of material. The trend toward greater transparency and public accessibility in museum collecting seems likely to work in favour of institutional acquisition, but the extraordinary prices these vehicles now command may put them out of reach for all but the most well-resourced institutions. The digital dimension of the story deserves mention as well. In recent years, advances in digital documentation technology have made it possible to create extraordinarily detailed records of surviving vehicles, capturing their current state with a level of precision that was previously unattainable. Three-dimensional scanning, high-resolution photography, and detailed digital cataloguing are being applied to historically significant vehicles in ways that create permanent records independent of the physical objects themselves. This digital documentation is valuable in multiple ways. It preserves information about the vehicles regardless of their ultimate physical fate. It makes that information accessible to researchers and the public, regardless of where the physical objects are located, and it provides a baseline record against which future changes to the vehicles can be measured and documented. Several of the most significant surviving Hitler-era Mercedes vehicles have undergone this kind of digital documentation as part of broader archival projects, and the resulting records are gradually becoming available through academic and institutional channels. The philosophical question that hovers over this entire story is one that historians and ethicists have grappled with for decades. What is the appropriate relationship between a society and the material artifacts of its worst moments? There is no universally accepted answer. Different cultures and different traditions have come to different conclusions about how to handle the physical remnants of historical evil. Some prefer destruction, eliminating the objects and thus refusing to allow them any ongoing presence in the cultural landscape. Others prefer preservation and public display, arguing that forgetting is more dangerous than remembering and that physical objects have an irreplaceable role in keeping memory alive. Others argue for a middle path: preserve the objects, but restrict access and control the context of display in ways that prevent them from serving as vehicles for nostalgia or celebration. The Hitler. Mercedes occupy a particularly acute position in this debate precisely because they are so extraordinary as automobiles. They are not merely repugnant objects whose only significance is their connection to evil. They are also genuine masterworks of engineering and craftsmanship, machines that represent the very pinnacle of automotive technology in their era, and that would be remarkable and valuable objects regardless of their history. This combination of aesthetic and technical excellence with moral horror is precisely what makes them so challenging to handle. It would be easier in some ways if they were simply ugly or shoddy. The fact that they are magnificent makes the horror more profound and the questions about how to handle them more complex. The story of what happened to Hitler's personal Mercedes-Benz after World War II is ultimately a story about the persistence of the past, about how the physical objects of history carry their histories with them through time, accumulating meanings and controversies and dollar values that their creators could never have imagined. The engineers and craftsmen of the Daimler-Benz factory who built these cars in the late 1930s and early 1940s were making luxury automobiles for the head of state of what was, at that moment, the most powerful nation in Europe. They could not have known that their creations would still be sitting in auction houses and museum galleries 80 years later, generating headlines and controversy and selling for $10 million to anonymous bidders. They could not have known that the regime for which they built would be destroyed within a decade, its leader dead by his own hand, its armies defeated, its crimes catalogued in meticulous detail by the prosecutors at Nuremberg. And yet, here the cars are, still rolling through history as surely as they once rolled through the streets of Vienna and Paris, carrying with them all the weight of what they witnessed and what they represent. The story invites us, if we are willing to accept the invitation, to think carefully about the relationship between objects and events, between aesthetics and politics, between craftsmanship and context. A grosser Mercedes is, taken in purely technical terms, a remarkable piece of machinery. Taken in historical context, it is something altogether more complex. A survivor of one of the most terrible chapters in human history, an object that was in the service of evil on a scale that is still difficult to fully comprehend, and a reminder that the line between extraordinary accomplishment and extraordinary horror can be disturbingly thin. These cars did not commit crimes, but they were instruments of a regime that did, and understanding what they were, where they came from, and what happened to them after the war is part of understanding that regime and its legacy in a way that no purely written or photographic record can quite replace. The surviving examples of Hitler's Mercedes fleet are, in the end, historical witnesses. They were there. They were present at the events that shaped the 20th century in its worst moments. They carried the man who ordered the Holocaust from city to city, from triumph to triumph, and then to defeat and oblivion. That they continue to exist, while so many of the human beings who suffered under the regime they served do not, is one of the many uncomfortable ironies of material history. The question of what we do with them, how we look at them, what we say about them, and what we do not say remains genuinely open. There is no formula that resolves the tension between the historian's obligation to preserve and understand and the human instinct to reject and destroy what is morally intolerable. What there is, instead, is the ongoing obligation to think carefully, to contextualize honestly, and to refuse the easy answers that obscure more than they reveal. So the next time you see a photograph of one of these extraordinary, terrible machines, take a moment to think about everything it carries with it, the engineering brilliance of the men who built it, the forced labor of those who had no choice, the propaganda genius of those who used it, the soldiers who found it in a mountain garage in 1945, the auction house bidders who competed for it decades later, and the millions of people who were there in the streets as it passed, whether in joy or in terror, in the dark years when it was new. These are not just cars, they are concentrated history, and they deserve to be treated with the seriousness that history demands. Well, that is it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative. If you enjoyed learning about what happened to Hitler's personal Mercedes-Benz vehicles after World War II, make sure to check out our video about what happened to Germany's top field marshals after World War II. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one!